The first light of dawn trickled in through the single-pane windows of Clinton High School, casting soft golden lines across worn wooden desks, scuffed with years of initials and the carved-out symbols of restless students. Outside, a chill lingered in the southern air, one of those early November mornings that hadn't yet decided if it wanted to warm up or remain cold and biting. Inside, Tanya Walker tightened her grip on her books, cradling them close to her chest as she walked down the hall. The rhythmic clinking of her footsteps echoed off the empty corridor. Though the day had just begun, she already felt the familiar twist in her stomach, that anxious flutter she'd learned to ignore by now. Tanya was always among the first to arrive at school, partly to avoid the clusters of classmates who could turn from indifferent to cruel in a heartbeat, but mostly because she needed a few minutes alone in the classroom, a small slice of peace before the noise started. As she walked into the classroom, she was met by the faint smell of chalk and the squeak of the old door swinging shut behind her. She made her way to her usual seat in the back row, near the window, where she could look outside if she needed an escape, even if it was just her mind drifting through that patch of sky. This morning, however, her gaze didn't reach the window. Instead, it stopped short, frozen by something on her desk. An old, worn yearbook lay open to a page near the center, as if placed there intentionally. She blinked, taken aback. There was no reason for a yearbook to be on her desk. She hadn't seen one this old in years. Clinton High rarely showed any interest in its past. Tanya set her books down and slowly pulled the yearbook closer. The cover was faded and cracked, the spine just barely holding on, and the pages had yellowed with time. Her fingers hovered over the book before she opened it, her skin brushing against the brittle edges. On the page in front of her was a photograph of a girl posed with a shy but determined smile. She wore a plain dress and a serious expression, her eyes trained straight ahead with a hint of defiance. There was something strikingly familiar about the girl, though Tanya couldn't place why. Beneath the photograph was a name, Dorothy Mayfield, and next to it, scrawled in neat, cursive handwriting, was a message that sent a shiver down Tanya's spine. "Keep pushing forward. History remembers." The words felt intimate, as if they were speaking directly to her. She reread the line, feeling a strange weight settle in her chest. There was a faint scent coming off the page, a mixture of old paper, dust, and something else, like the faintest whiff of lavender. Tanya frowned, running her fingers over the ink, but it seemed embedded deep in the paper, untouched for decades. The room was still empty, and yet she felt watched, like the eyes of generations past were on her, waiting to see what she would do with this moment. She shook off the sensation, glancing over her shoulder just to be sure, and then went back to examining the page. Dorothy Mayfield's photograph stood out starkly against the faded backdrop of the other, less familiar faces surrounding her. Tanya read the brief caption below the picture, "Class of 1954, Valedictorian." A chill ran down her spine again. Dorothy was a valedictorian. Tanya knew of no black valedictorians in the school's past, at least, not from what the school had ever publicized. That fact alone made her want to read more, to understand how a girl like Dorothy had managed such a feat, in a time when so many doors were shut. Tanya's concentration was broken by the sound of approaching footsteps and hushed laughter. She quickly closed the yearbook, pressing it under her other books just as a group of classmates walked in. One girl, Mallory, caught Tanya's eye and raised an eyebrow, with a mocking smirk before whispering something to the girl next to her. They both laughed, and Tanya felt heat rising in her cheeks. She looked down, feigning indifference, her mind already pulling back to Dorothy's mysterious photograph. Class began, but Tanya barely heard the teacher's voice droning on about assignments and upcoming exams. Her thoughts kept drifting back to Dorothy, wondering what challenges she'd faced, what it must have been like to hold her head high in a world that likely told her to keep it down. The phrase from the yearbook echoed in her mind, "Keep pushing forward. History remembers." The morning passed in a haze, her mind caught between the real world and the strange, new mystery that had unexpectedly surfaced. When lunch came, Tanya slipped out of the classroom and made her way to the library. It was the one place in the school where she felt truly at ease. The rows of books, the quiet, the faint hum of fluorescent lights, it all felt like home. In the back corner, where the older, forgotten yearbooks and archived records were kept, Tanya searched for another copy of the yearbook with Dorothy's picture. But despite scanning several shelves, she couldn't find it. The 1954 yearbook was missing. Tanya paused, considering the possibility that the copy she'd found in the classroom wasn't supposed to be there, that perhaps it had been intentionally placed for her to find. But by who, And why? She felt a flicker of frustration mingled with excitement. Her fingers grazed the empty slot where the yearbook should have been, feeling the dust there, undisturbed. Someone had hidden this yearbook, or at the very least, hadn't wanted it to be easily found. Taking a deep breath, she decided to visit the oldest part of the library, a section dedicated to local history. She hoped to find any mention of Dorothy Mayfield. As she flipped through brittle pages of old newspaper clippings and black and white photos, she caught faint snippets of stories about the school, past graduates, and achievements. Yet, even here, there was no mention of a black valedictorian from 1954. Tanya's hands started to tremble. The mystery was deepening, but instead of feeling discouraged, she felt an unfamiliar thrill. Dorothy's existence felt realer with each moment, yet her story was somehow buried, hidden beneath layers of dust and silence. As she left the library, the bell rang, signaling the end of lunch. Tanya walked back to class with Dorothy's words resonating in her mind, like an unbreakable thread tying her to the past. Her steps felt heavier but more purposeful, each one a quiet rebellion against the silence that had tried to erase Dorothy and everything she represented. By the end of the day, Tanya was exhausted, but her mind buzzed with questions and a lingering sense of something important left unsaid. She couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just taken the first step on a path that would challenge everything she thought she knew about her school, her community, and even herself. As she stepped outside and felt the crisp November air fill her lungs, she knew one thing for sure: she wouldn't let Dorothy's story remain forgotten. Tanya's morning routine was a carefully orchestrated dance of silence. She would rise before anyone else in her small, cramped home and tiptoe around creaky floorboards, hoping not to wake her younger siblings or her parents, who both worked double shifts. Her room was a tiny space wedged into a corner of the house, barely big enough for a bed, a desk, and her growing stack of textbooks. But she loved it. The modest room was her own private retreat, filled with carefully marked up copies of her history books, and an old corkboard where she'd pinned pictures of her dream colleges and newspaper clippings of prominent black scholars. This morning, Tanya looked in the mirror before leaving her room, adjusting the tight bun she wore her hair in daily. It was neat and professional, something that made her feel composed, even when the world around her was anything but. Her routine was her armor. She needed it. Ever since she started high school, Tanya had learned that her ambition and intelligence set her apart in ways that some people couldn't accept. Being top of her class, being vocal, and asking questions others were too afraid to ask these things made her a target. And while she didn't mind the hard work or the challenge, the way her peers treated her was a different story. At school, her reputation was sealed with a single phrase: trying too hard. The other students whispered it in the hallways when she passed by, or muttered it just loud enough when she raised her hand in class. They treated her academic accomplishments as something unnatural or bothersome. Even some teachers seemed to feel this way, often questioning her motivation in subtle but sharp ways. "You know, Tanya, there's more to life than academics," they'd say with that gentle but unmistakable condescension. But Tanya knew there was more. History was more than just a subject to her, it was a lifeline, a way of making sense of her own experiences in a world that seemed stacked against her. Her family story, she often felt, was just one thread in a larger fabric of resilience, a tale woven from generations of endurance. Her great-grandfather had been a sharecropper, her grandmother had marched in civil rights protests, and her own mother had fought hard to keep a steady job while raising her kids. The past was more than dates and facts, it was alive, breathing in her blood, a testament to what was possible despite hardship. Yet her love for history only seemed to widen the gap between her and her peers. Most of them couldn't understand why she spent so much time in the library, or why she cared so deeply about stories of people long gone. Some of her classmates mocked her behind her back, calling her the professor or, on particularly cruel days, the Black Hermione. But Tanya didn't let their words get to her. At least, she tried not to. She couldn't help feeling like an outsider. And in a town where belonging often came with a narrow set of expectations, Tanya's dreams marked her as someone different, someone who didn't quite fit. Her family didn't fully understand her ambitions either. Her mother and father had each graduated high school, but college had never been on their radar. To them, work and family were all that mattered, and they wanted Tanya to be safe and secure, not running off on wild dreams. Her mother would often say things like, "Why stir up trouble, Tanya? Get your diploma, find a good job, and don't make waves." For her parents, a steady paycheck and a good reputation in town were the marks of success. These words weighed on Tanya more than she let on. In her parents' eyes, she sometimes saw fear that she would break away, leave the only world they knew, and become someone they could no longer protect. While she respected their fears, she couldn't let them hold her back. She had a burning need to see more of the world, to learn about things she could only find in the pages of her books. The only person who truly understood her was her grandmother, a woman who, despite her age and the burdens life had placed on her, possessed a fierce and unyielding spirit. Her grandmother's face was lined with decades of struggle and strength, and her voice carried the weight of stories that stretched back generations. To Tanya, her grandmother was a wellspring of wisdom. She was the one person in Tanya's life who seemed to see her, really see her, not as someone strange or too much, but as someone who had inherited a rare fire. Her grandmother's small house was a short walk from her own, and on most weekends, Tanya would visit her to sit by the old, patchwork quilt in the living room and listen as her grandmother told stories of the past. She would tell Tanya about the marches she had joined as a young woman, standing shoulder to shoulder with people who had dared to dream of equality, even in a world that seemed hell-bent on denying them that right. Her grandmother would describe each detail, every chant, every step in those marches, and as she spoke, Tanya would feel a powerful sense of belonging, as if she was walking alongside them. "You have to know where you come from, Tanya," her grandmother would say. "The world will tell you that history doesn't matter, that the past is just the past. But that's only because they're afraid of what it can teach you. They're afraid of the strength it gives you." Those words echoed in Tanya's mind whenever she faced her classmates' taunts or the dismissive glances from teachers who didn't understand why she bothered. Her grandmother's wisdom was her anchor. It kept her grounded, reminding her that she wasn't just studying history for the sake of a grade. She was uncovering the strength of those who had come before her, a strength that ran through her own veins. Her dream was to study history at Howard University, where she could learn from scholars who shared her passion and who understood her experiences. The idea of attending a university filled with other ambitious black students felt like a lifeline, a place where she might finally belong. She would look up pictures of Howard online and imagine herself walking its campus, carrying her books with pride instead of hiding them against her chest. She even had a letter from Howard's admissions office pinned to her wall, a reminder that her dream was within reach. Yet, despite her hopes and her resilience, the journey wasn't easy. Tanya often felt the weight of being too much for her classmates and too different for her family. At school, the bullying took many forms. Some days it was subtle, the sideways glances, the whispered jokes, the rolled eyes whenever she spoke up in class. Other days it was more overt. She remembered one particular incident last year when a group of students had thrown crumpled paper balls at her during lunch, snickering as they whispered, "Try hard," under their breaths. She had brushed it off, but each small act left an impression, a quiet pain she carried with her, tucked away alongside her books and dreams. But despite the hurt, Tanya's desire to learn, to achieve, and to prove herself remained unshaken. She wasn't fighting just for herself, she was fighting for her family's legacy, for her grandmother's stories, and for every ancestor whose story had been silenced or forgotten. She wanted to be a part of history, not as a passive observer, but as someone who had dared to make a difference. Her grandmother always encouraged her, saying, "Baby, don't let anyone tell you that you're too much. People say that when they're afraid of your power, when they can't see what you see. You're meant for big things, Tanya. You carry all of us with you." The words were comforting, but as the weeks leading up to graduation drew closer, Tanya felt the pressure mounting. She had already been named Valedictorian, a title that brought its own share of challenges. Her classmates viewed her accomplishment with a mix of resentment and disbelief, as if she had somehow cheated to reach the top. Her teachers, while congratulatory, often reminded her of her responsibility as the class leader, a responsibility that felt less like support and more like an admonition to keep her head down, to be grateful, to be uncontroversial. And then there was her family's mixed reaction. Her mother had been proud but reserved, offering a quiet good job and a pat on the back. Her father had nodded approvingly, but there was a distance in his gaze, as if he didn't fully understand why this achievement mattered so much to her. The weight of their expectations pressed down on her. They wanted her to succeed, but they also wanted her to be normal, to fit in, to avoid drawing attention to herself. For Tanya, fitting in was impossible. Every fiber of her being wanted to stand out, to embrace her intelligence and her love for history, to forge a path that her family had never dreamed of. And while she carried her family's expectations with her, she knew she couldn't let them dictate her future. Her grandmother's voice, her wisdom, her unbreakable spirit, these were the things that propelled Tanya forward. Even when the world around her seemed determined to hold her back, she had a responsibility, not just to herself but to the generations that had come before her, to carry their stories with pride and to pave the way for those who would come after her. And so, with every whispered insult, every dismissive glance, every doubting voice, Tanya found herself more determined than ever. Her journey was far from over, and she knew that it would only get harder. But as she stood at the threshold of her dreams, ready to step into a future that few could envision, she held on to her grandmother's words, her own quiet rebellion against a world that wanted her to shrink. In her heart, she carried the voices of the past and the strength of her own story, ready to be written. One late afternoon, after a particularly long day of classes and whispered insults, Tanya found herself seeking refuge in the school library. It was her safe space, a quiet place where she could immerse herself in books, surrounded by the comforting scent of old paper and polished wood. The library was nearly empty at this hour, save for the occasional murmur from the librarian and the soft rustle of pages turning. The sunlight slanted through the tall windows, casting long, golden streaks across the rows of bookshelves, and dust motes floated lazily in the warm light. Tanya walked down the aisles, her fingers brushing the spines of books, searching for nothing in particular, just letting herself unwind. As she wandered, she reached the section where the school's historical archives were kept, a narrow shelf in the back, stacked with old yearbooks and faded school newsletters. Most students ignored this corner, but Tanya was often drawn to it, intrigued by the lives and stories captured in those pages. She loved imagining the students who had come before her, what their lives might have been like, and the moments they cherished. Today, however, something was different. As she ran her hand across the row of dusty yearbooks, her fingers paused on one that looked a little out of place. It was smaller and older than the rest, its spine cracked and worn, and tucked slightly behind the others, as if someone had tried to hide it. Curious, she pulled the book from the shelf, gently blowing off the thin layer of dust that clung to its cover. The cover was faded, but bore the emblem of her school from the 1950s, a time she'd never really thought about in connection with this place. A strange feeling settled over her, a slight prickle at the back of her neck, like she was trespassing into someone else's memories. Tanya carried the yearbook to a table by the window, its leather binding creaking as she opened it. The black and white photos inside were grainy, and each page had the faint smell of old paper mingled with a hint of something musty, as though it had been locked away for decades. She scanned through group photos of students dressed in formal clothes, with serious faces and neatly combed hair, a world so different from her own. As she turned each page, she saw groups labeled by clubs and sports teams, a few short blurbs about class achievements, and some quotes from faculty members. Then she reached a section titled Class Leaders, and there, nestled between a few brief biographies, she noticed something unusual. The face of a young black girl, her dark eyes steady and confident, her expression serious yet proud. Underneath the photograph, in elegant scripted lettering, was the name Dorothy Mayfield, and beside it, a short description, Valedictorian of the class of 1954. Tanya blinked, her heart giving a small, unexpected leap. She had never heard of Dorothy Mayfield before, and she'd never imagined there was a black valedictorian at her school in the 1950s. It was strange, given that the school's walls were decorated with plaques commemorating past academic achievements, none of which mentioned Dorothy or her accomplishments. The omission felt deliberate. She read the text below Dorothy's name, in recognition of her academic excellence and determination. Keep pushing forward. History remembers. A shiver ran down her spine as she read the words, the same words she'd seen in the faded handwriting on the yearbook she'd found on her desk the other day. Tanya's fingers grazed the inscription, feeling a chill despite the warmth of the sun streaming in through the window. It was as if Dorothy herself were reaching out across the years, her message echoing down the corridors of time, touching Tanya with a familiar sense of both purpose and isolation. The coincidence was too strong to ignore. She could practically feel Dorothy's presence in the room, a silent force watching over her, urging her to uncover something deeper. Dorothy's story was like an invitation, a promise that history remembered even when the present tried to erase it. She flipped through the rest of the yearbook, looking for any other mention of Dorothy, but found nothing beyond that single page. It felt strange, as if someone had deliberately minimized her presence, reduced her to a single image and a line of text. In all her years at this school, Tanya had never heard Dorothy's name. Why hadn't the school celebrated her, a black valedictorian, in a time when such achievements were rare and groundbreaking? And yet, here was Dorothy, her legacy preserved in this single, hidden yearbook, as if it had been waiting for Tanya to discover it. As she continued flipping through the pages, Tanya noticed something even stranger. The very last page of the yearbook was torn, with only the faint outlines of what seemed like handwritten notes or signatures remaining on the edges. It looked as if someone had deliberately ripped it out, concealing whatever final messages were left there. But why? Tanya looked around the library, half expecting to see someone watching her, but the only other person nearby was the librarian, an older woman who was busy stacking books at the front desk. It felt as if the room had fallen completely silent, amplifying the quiet rustle of her fingers turning the pages, the only sound in the room. She was alone with the mystery. Unable to shake the feeling that this discovery was important, Tanya slipped the yearbook into her backpack. She knew she wasn't supposed to take it, but the thought of leaving it there, where it might go unnoticed or hidden again, was unbearable. This was more than a relic, it was a story, one that felt unsettlingly similar to her own. Dorothy had walked these same halls, endured the same struggles, and had somehow faded into obscurity. Tanya couldn't help but wonder, was this her future too? Later that night, in her bedroom, Tanya pored over the yearbook under the dim light of her desk lamp. She traced Dorothy's photo with her fingers, feeling an odd sense of kinship with the girl who had once occupied her place as the top student in a school that didn't truly welcome her. Questions flooded her mind. Had Dorothy's achievements been recognized? Had she gone on to college? Or had her dreams been quietly buried, just like the page that was torn from the yearbook? She remembered her grandmother's words about knowing where you come from and honoring the strength of the past. Maybe Dorothy's story wasn't just a hidden piece of history, maybe it was a part of her own journey. As she stared into Dorothy's eyes, Tanya felt a renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't just studying history, she was a part of it, carrying forward a legacy that had tried to be silenced. The next day, Tanya couldn't shake the feeling that Dorothy was lingering close, almost guiding her. She had the yearbook tucked in her bag as she walked through the school's hallways, noticing details she'd overlooked before: the chipped paint on the lockers, the cracked tiles in the floor, and the quiet resignation on the faces of some of the other students who, like her, felt unseen. It was as if Dorothy's presence had sharpened her senses, allowing her to see the school through a new lens, one that revealed the invisible struggles woven into its fabric. During her lunch break, she visited the school's trophy case, a dusty display that contained decades' worth of academic and athletic awards. She scanned the plaques, looking for any mention of Dorothy, but all she found were names she didn't recognize, mostly boys, mostly white. Dorothy's name was nowhere to be seen. It was as if she'd been erased, reduced to a hidden photograph and a line in a yearbook no one was meant to find. Determined to know more, Tanya approached the librarian, hoping she might have some insight into the yearbook or Dorothy's story. The librarian looked at her curiously when she mentioned Dorothy's name. "Dorothy Mayfield?" the librarian repeated, a slight frown on her face. "I haven't heard that name in a long time." She was a brilliant student, but she hesitated, glancing around the room as if someone might be listening. It wasn't easy for her. There were problems. What kind of problems? Tanya pressed, sensing that the librarian knew more than she was letting on. The librarian sighed, her gaze distant. It was a different time back then. People didn't want someone like Dorothy taking the spotlight. She was smart, but she paid a price for it. I think some people just wanted to forget she was ever here. A chill settled over Tanya as the words sank in. It was as if Dorothy's story had been buried intentionally, hidden from the school's history. But why? And by whom? That night, back in her room, Tanya replayed the librarian's words, feeling a sense of anger and sadness welling up inside her. Dorothy had achieved something remarkable, only to be erased, her story buried and forgotten. And now, Tanya had found herself in a similar place, standing on the edge of her own dreams, but facing the same quiet hostility and dismissive glances. She realized that she wasn't just discovering Dorothy's story, she was living it. But unlike Dorothy, she refused to let herself be erased. Holding the yearbook tightly, Tanya made a silent promise. She would find out what happened to Dorothy, and she would make sure that no one could ever forget her again. Driven by a sense of duty and fascination, Tanya devoted her spare time to finding out more about Dorothy Mayfield. The yearbook had been her introduction, but the more she thought about it, the more she felt there had to be more to the story. Dorothy's brief, proud description had captured her imagination, but Tanya suspected that this snippet was merely the tip of the iceberg. She began her search in the only place she knew where to start, the local archives. The town's small, historical society library was tucked away on a side street, a modest, brick building with faded shingles and a quiet air that suggested few people visited often. Tanya's heart beat with quiet excitement as she walked in, the smell of old books mingling with a faint trace of dust. A silver-haired woman with a gentle smile greeted her from behind the desk. "Hello, dear. How can I help you today?" the librarian asked. Tanya hesitated, feeling a strange thrill of secrecy. "I'm doing some research on a former student. Dorothy Mayfield. She was the valedictorian in 1954, I think." The librarian's face softened, though her eyes held a touch of sadness. "Dorothy, yes. I remember hearing about her. Bright girl, always determined. You don't hear her name much these days, but back then she was quite the talk of the town." She sighed and motioned toward a back room. "The old newspapers are stored back there. You may find something about her if you look." Thanking the librarian, Tanya headed into the back, where shelves upon shelves of yellowed newspapers and clippings waited. She leafed through a few papers from 1954, eyes skimming over headlines about local dances, fairs, and the occasional national news story. After nearly half an hour of searching, she found a small article about the graduation ceremony, and there, nestled between paragraphs of generic ceremony descriptions, was a single line. Valedictorian Dorothy Mayfield delivered a shortened version of her original speech, which the school administration felt was too radical for the occasion. The phrase stopped her cold. Too radical for the occasion. She read it again, her brow furrowing in curiosity and disbelief. What could a high school senior have possibly said that was so controversial? The phrase filled her with a sense of both admiration and a prickling anger, as if Dorothy's voice had been silenced before it could even echo through the town. Tanya copied down the article in her notebook, feeling a strange kinship growing in her chest. Dorothy had dared to speak her mind, dared to challenge the status quo in a way that had been bold enough to frighten those in charge. But why had her words been seen as radical? Determined to learn more, Tanya decided to visit a few elderly townspeople who had been around during Dorothy's time. Maybe, she thought, someone would remember her or the speech. After asking around, she learned of a retired teacher, Mrs. Hazel Owens, who was said to have attended the graduation that year. Hazel now lived in a modest home near the outskirts of town, and after some gentle persuading, Tanya managed to arrange a visit. The next day, Tanya found herself sitting across from Hazel in her cozy living room, her notebook open on her lap. The old woman, her eyes bright despite her years, studied Tanya for a moment before speaking. "I remember Dorothy well," Hazel began, a fond but wistful smile on her lips. "She was one of my brightest students, full of ambition. But the world wasn't ready for someone like her. She spoke up when others stayed silent, questioned things others took for granted." "What about her graduation speech?" Tanya asked, leaning forward. "I read that it was censored, that they thought it was too radical." Hazel's expression grew serious, her eyes clouding with a memory that seemed to both warm and haunt her. Dorothy wanted to talk about equality, true equality. She talked about how education should open doors for everyone, not just a select few. "I remember she wrote something about our shared responsibility to make the world better, but at that time, well, they called it inappropriate." She paused, then added with a heavy sigh. Her words frightened them. Tanya felt a surge of both pride and sadness for Dorothy. She imagined Dorothy standing at the podium, facing an audience that wasn't ready to hear what she had to say, a town not yet willing to look beyond its own narrow views. She pictured the determination on Dorothy's face, the courage it must have taken to write those words, let alone stand up to deliver them. "She wanted to go to college," Hazel continued, her voice softening. "She had her heart set on one of the big universities up north, where she believed she'd find more freedom, more opportunity. But, well, opportunities weren't so easily given to girls like her back then." Tanya nodded, her heart aching as she thought about Dorothy's dreams, the ones she had never been able to chase. She scribbled down Hazel's words in her notebook, feeling a growing sense of responsibility to tell this story, to make sure Dorothy's voice wasn't silenced again. As Tanya made her way back home that evening, her mind buzzed with thoughts and emotions. Dorothy's story felt so familiar, so similar to her own struggles. She wondered if Dorothy had felt the same loneliness, the same sense of being out of place. The weight of Dorothy's ambitions and struggles seemed to hang around her, like a legacy passed down through time. The next morning, Tanya returned to the school library to look for anything that could shed more light on Dorothy's life. The librarian, seeing her dedication, allowed her access to a few old filing cabinets filled with student records and faculty notes. Tanya combed through the files, reading about the curriculum of the 1950s, the strict rules students were expected to follow. And finally she came across a note in one of the faculty logs. Dorothy Mayfield, reprimanded for using unapproved language during her speech rehearsal. Tanya's hand paused over the words. Unapproved language. She closed her eyes, imagining Dorothy frustrated, fighting to make her words heard but facing resistance every step of the way. Her determination to speak, despite knowing the consequences, spoke volumes about her strength. The librarian, noticing Tanya's interest, shared another detail. Some say Dorothy had written letters about her experiences here. She was very vocal, that one, very driven. She'd write about how things should be better, not just for her, but for everyone who came after her. Do you know where those letters are? Tanya asked, hope surging through her. The librarian frowned, shaking her head. No one's seen them for years. I think someone may have hidden them away, fearing her words would cause trouble. But who knows? Sometimes things have a way of resurfacing. Tanya was discouraged, but not deterred. She returned to the archives, determined to keep looking, and stumbled upon a few scraps of correspondence in the bottom of a forgotten drawer. One letter was addressed to Dorothy from a professor at a university up north. The words were faded, but Tanya could make out just enough to understand that Dorothy had applied for a scholarship and had been considered a promising candidate. Her heart leaped. Dorothy had been close to achieving her dreams, close to escaping the small town and its narrow mindset, but there was no mention of whether she had ever attended. The trail grew colder, and Tanya felt the weight of Dorothy's unresolved story pressing on her, a mystery begging to be solved. The more she uncovered, the deeper her connection to Dorothy grew. Tanya felt like she was piecing together not just Dorothy's story, but also the stories of countless others who had been forgotten or overlooked. Every clue she found seemed to whisper to her, urging her to keep searching, to see Dorothy's legacy through to the end. The fragments were small, almost invisible on their own, but together they painted a picture of resilience, ambition, and an indomitable spirit. In the days that followed, Tanya found herself growing more and more determined. She spent hours in the library, digging through yearbooks, newspapers, and forgotten files, all while trying to manage her own schoolwork and responsibilities. Each discovery, each new clue, felt like a step closer to the truth. Then, one afternoon she came across a photograph in the local archives. It was a simple, black and white image of a group of students standing outside the school, but at the edge of the frame, she recognized Dorothy. Unlike the other students, who stood smiling and carefree, Dorothy's face was tense, her posture upright and resolute. Her eyes held a mixture of defiance and pride, as if she had dared the world to look away. For the first time, Tanya felt as though she understood Dorothy not just as a figure from the past, but as a friend, a sister, someone who shared her dreams and her struggles. Dorothy's journey had been difficult, but her courage, her willingness to stand up and be counted, had left an indelible mark on Tanya's heart. That night, as she lay in bed, Tanya thought about everything she had learned. She felt a deep sense of gratitude to Dorothy, who had blazed a trail even if it was one that history had tried to cover. Dorothy had endured so much, yet her spirit had survived, hidden in whispers and echoes, waiting for someone like Tanya to bring it back to life. And now, Tanya knew she had to go further, to find out what had happened to Dorothy after that graduation ceremony. She had to keep searching, not just for Dorothy's story, but for her own. Tanya's curiosity had blossomed into a full-fledged mission, but it didn't take long before she began to feel the weight of disapproval from those around her. At school, her teachers seemed increasingly impatient with her. Mrs. Caldwell, Her history teacher, who usually praised Tanya's work ethic, now watched her with a thinly veiled irritation every time she raised her hand to ask about local history or social movements of the past. Finally, after one class, Mrs. Caldwell called her over with a forced smile. "Tanya, I appreciate your interest in, what was her name again? Dorothy Mayfield?" Her voice was gentle but edged with a hint of frustration. "But you must understand, we have a lot to cover in this course. Focusing on the contributions of one person, one student, no less doesn't give you a complete picture of history." "But Dorothy's story isn't just about her," Tanya replied, determined. "It's about how people in this town, people who looked like me, weren't allowed to speak up or pursue their dreams. Doesn't that matter?" Mrs. Caldwell sighed, adjusting her glasses. "Tanya, sometimes it's better to look forward than to dig up the past. There are plenty of success stories today that you can focus on. Isn't it more productive to celebrate those?" Tanya's jaw tightened. "So we're just supposed to forget about people like Dorothy?" Mrs. Caldwell gave her a sympathetic look. "It's not about forgetting, Tanya. It's about perspective. Think about it. You're a bright girl with a future ahead of you. Don't get distracted." The words stung, and Tanya felt her resolve waver. Was she making a mistake? Was this really just a distraction? She thought about her college applications, her desire to go far from this town and make a name for herself. Was she jeopardizing all of that by spending her time on someone the town had already chosen to forget? But then she remembered the pride in Dorothy's expression in that old photo, the quiet determination of a girl who hadn't had the privileges Tanya did. Dorothy's struggle wasn't a distraction, it was a reminder of how far they had come, and how far they still had to go. Tanya tried to shake off her frustration, but things grew harder. A few of her classmates began to take notice of her interest in Dorothy's story and started making sarcastic comments. They called her Dorothy's ghost or Little Miss History. In the hallways, they would whisper behind her back or make exaggerated yawns when she walked by. Tanya tried to ignore it, but every comment chipped away at her confidence, making her question if this was all worth it. One day during lunch, as Tanya sat alone flipping through her notes, she felt a presence behind her. She looked up to see Melissa, a popular girl who often led the teasing, smirking as she dropped a thick textbook on the table in front of Tanya. "You're still digging into that nobody from the 50s? Melissa asked, her tone laced with mockery. "She wasn't a nobody," Tanya replied quietly, refusing to meet Melissa's eyes. "Oh, really?" Melissa rolled her eyes, loud enough for a few other students to snicker. "Sounds like you're just looking for attention. It's like totally weird." Tanya clenched her fists but said nothing. She gathered her notes and left the table, swallowing the lump in her throat. But each insult only fueled a growing sense of loneliness. Was she really alone in this? That evening, she approached her parents, hoping for support. She explained Dorothy's story to them, her excitement shining through as she described what she'd learned, her voice cracking with emotion. But her father's face tightened with worry, and her mother frowned. "Honey," her mother said, choosing her words carefully, "I know you care about this girl's story, but is this really necessary?" Tanya blinked in disbelief. "What do you mean, Mom?" Her father cleared his throat. "Look, Tanya, you're smart, you have big plans. We don't want you getting sidetracked by controversy." "Controversy? It's history," Tanya protested, her voice rising. "Your father's right," her mother added. "These kinds of stories, they bring trouble. People get sensitive about them. You don't want to hurt your chances for college." Her parents' disapproval hurt the most. She had hoped they would understand, that they'd see how Dorothy's story connected to her own. Instead, they seemed afraid, as if Dorothy's legacy was a burden they didn't want Tanya to carry. As she returned to her room, the weight of everything settled over her, pressing down on her shoulders. She spent the rest of the night staring at her notebook, feeling for the first time that maybe, just maybe, everyone was right. Maybe she should let it go, focus on her studies, and leave Dorothy's story buried where the town wanted it. The next morning, as she opened her locker, a small piece of folded paper tumbled out. Tanya picked it up, frowning. She hadn't seen anyone near her locker all day. Curious, she unfolded the note, her heart skipping as she read the single line scrawled in neat, careful handwriting. "We stand on shoulders of strength." Her breath caught. It was one of the lines Hazel had mentioned from Dorothy's censored speech, a line that encapsulated Dorothy's beliefs and dreams. But who had left it in her locker? How had they known about Dorothy's words? The message was a revelation, a quiet reminder that Dorothy's voice hadn't been silenced completely. Someone had remembered. Someone else, maybe even here at this school, understood Dorothy's significance. Tanya felt a surge of determination flood through her. Whoever had left the note wanted her to keep going, wanted her to know she wasn't alone. With a renewed sense of purpose, she went back to the library, her mind buzzing with questions. She didn't know who had left the note, but she knew she had to keep looking. Tanya spent hours combing through records, focusing on the years after Dorothy's graduation. She found a few faint traces of her life. A small notice in the college acceptance records from a school up north. A brief mention of her name in a protest against racial discrimination. Dorothy had tried to leave the town's shadow, but every article suggested that the same obstacles had followed her, as though the town's indifference had haunted her all her life. And yet, she'd pressed forward, refusing to let the world define her. Tanya's pursuit of Dorothy's story became relentless. She returned to Mrs. Hazel Owens, hoping the older woman could give her more details about Dorothy's later years. As they sipped tea in Hazel's living room, Tanya finally asked the question that had been on her mind since she'd begun this journey. "Do you know what happened to Dorothy? Did she ever achieve her dreams?" Hazel sighed, her gaze distant. Dorothy never stopped fighting Tanya, but the world wasn't kind to her. She faced disappointment after disappointment, and, well, I suppose it broke her spirit over time. Tanya felt a pang of sorrow and anger. It wasn't fair. Dorothy had given everything, had stood her ground, but the world had still denied her the life she'd deserved. Hazel patted Tanya's hand. But her strength, her determination, that's the part of her that lives on. That's the part that's important. And it seems to me that you've inherited some of that strength. As Tanya left Hazel's home, she knew she couldn't stop now. Dorothy's story, despite its heartbreak, was a legacy that needed to be honored. If the town wanted to forget Dorothy, Tanya would make sure they couldn't. The box looked ordinary at first. It was shoved in the corner of her grandmother's attic, half buried under a blanket and stacks of old newspapers. Tanya might have missed it altogether if she hadn't been so desperate for answers. But something drew her to that box, as if an invisible thread pulled her forward. She brushed the dust away, her fingers trembling with a mixture of anticipation and dread. The cardboard was worn, softening at the edges, and when she opened it, a faint scent of aged paper and lavender rose to greet her. Inside, she found a few faded photographs, old letters tied with a ribbon, and a slim, tarnished medal. Gently, almost reverently, she lifted the medal. It gleamed faintly, the word Valedictorian engraved along the curve. Tanya felt a sudden jolt, her throat tightening as she realized what she was holding. Dorothy's medal, the one symbol of her achievement, the one reminder that she had once been celebrated, if only briefly. Beneath the medal lay a handwritten speech, neatly folded but frayed at the edges. Tanya unfolded it carefully, her hands trembling as she smoothed out the yellowed paper. The ink was slightly faded, but Dorothy's handwriting was unmistakably strong and determined, each word written with purpose. Tanya's eyes swept over the lines, the words that had been silenced, the dreams that had been buried. "I stand here today, not only for myself, but for all those who have come before me and those who will follow," Dorothy had written. "For those who have been unseen, unheard, and undervalued. I am here for them as I am here for me. I dream of a future where no one is judged for the color of their skin, where each person's worth is celebrated, where voices like mine are welcomed, not silenced." Tanya's chest tightened as she read the words, raw and powerful, daring yet hopeful. Dorothy had dreamed of a world where she could be seen for her intelligence, her strength, her humanity. She had written about her hopes for future generations, about wanting them to be seen, valued, and celebrated. This wasn't just a speech. It was a manifesto, a rallying cry from someone who had been pushed aside but refused to be erased. Tanya closed her eyes, feeling an overwhelming rush of emotion. Here was Dorothy, speaking across decades, her words reaching Tanya like a whisper, a hand held out through time. She could almost see Dorothy standing there, a young woman filled with quiet courage, staring down an audience that wouldn't let her finish her speech. She could almost hear her voice, steady and unbroken, even as it was being silenced. Tears began to blur Tanya's vision as she traced her fingers along the words. Dorothy had been braver than she could have imagined. She had looked beyond her own life, her own limitations, hoping that someone, someday, would carry her dreams forward. This was a woman who had known hardship, who had known what it meant to be invisible, yet had dared to hope, to believe, that someday things would be different. And here Tanya was, the very person Dorothy had written about. She was that future generation, standing on the shoulders of a woman who had once been told her voice didn't matter. Tanya's tears fell freely now, each drop soaking into the fragile paper. She could feel Dorothy's pain, her yearning for justice, her fierce desire for a future that honored every human being. It was as if she was standing in Dorothy's shoes, her own dreams suddenly intertwined with Dorothy's, her struggles not separate but part of a longer, harder journey, a journey of countless others who had dared to dream in a world that tried to shut them down. She wiped her eyes, her hands still shaking, and took a deep breath, letting Dorothy's words sink into her soul. For the first time, Tanya's own struggles felt different, not as an isolated fight, but as part of a legacy. She saw herself as a link in a chain that stretched back through time, one that couldn't be broken so long as she remembered those who had come before her. Her goal was no longer just about proving herself or achieving her dreams. It was about honoring Dorothy and all the others who had been silenced, whose stories had been forgotten. As she placed the speech back in the box, Tanya's resolve deepened. She knew she couldn't let Dorothy's story end here, in an attic gathering dust. Dorothy's dreams hadn't faded. They were here, alive and burning within Tanya. This discovery wasn't just about uncovering history, it was about reclaiming a voice that had been stolen, about giving Dorothy the acknowledgement she'd never received. Her grandmother's soft voice broke the silence, startling Tanya. She hadn't noticed her come up the attic stairs. "You found it, didn't you?" her grandmother asked, her face shadowed with a mix of sadness and pride. Tanya nodded, holding up the medal and the speech. "Why didn't you tell me?" Her grandmother's eyes softened, and she sat down beside Tanya, sighing as she looked at the objects. "I wanted to, but I was afraid you'd feel the same heartbreak Dorothy did. This town, this world, they don't always want to hear stories like hers. But I see now, you're stronger than I thought. You have a fire in you, just like she did." Tanya looked at her grandmother, searching her face for the strength she herself now felt. "I have to do something, Grandma. I can't let this stay hidden." Her grandmother placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Then do it, Tanya. Tell her story. Let the world know she was here." In that moment, Tanya felt an indescribable connection to Dorothy and to every woman in her family who had come before her. She knew now that her path forward wasn't just her own, it was Dorothy's as well. By honoring Dorothy, she was honoring herself and every future generation that might feel unseen or unheard. She spent the next few days obsessively reading through Dorothy's letters, each one a piece of the life Dorothy had dreamed of, the one she had been denied. Dorothy had written about her ambitions, her yearning to attend college and become a teacher, her desire to see a world where she wasn't just tolerated but embraced. In each line, Tanya felt Dorothy's fierce hope, her longing to break free from a world that had limited her at every turn. Tanya knew she had to share Dorothy's story, to show the world that Dorothy hadn't been a forgotten name in an old yearbook. She was real, and her story mattered. As she read the last letter in the box, a sense of peace settled over Tanya. She had been chosen, in a way. Dorothy's words had found their way to her for a reason. She thought of her classmates, her teachers, the ones who had told her to stop stirring up trouble, to forget the past and focus on her future. But Tanya knew now that her future was inseparable from Dorothy's past. To honor Dorothy was to honor herself, to say, "I am here, and I am part of this legacy." When Tanya finally closed the box, she felt an unbreakable bond to Dorothy, a promise to carry her dreams forward. Dorothy's words were no longer just a relic of history, they were a guide, a testament to strength and resilience. And as Tanya looked out the attic window, the weight of the sky above and the earth below grounding her, she knew that she would make sure Dorothy's voice would be heard. That night, for the first time in a long time, Tanya felt at peace. She had found her purpose, her calling not just to succeed for herself, but to bring honor to a legacy that the world had tried to erase. She fell asleep with Dorothy's speech on her bedside table, a faint smile on her face, knowing she would never feel alone in this journey again. As graduation day approached, Tanya found herself enveloped in a whirlwind of emotions. The anticipation of walking across that stage, receiving her diploma, and being named valedictorian filled her with both pride and anxiety. Yet, amidst the excitement, she was painfully aware of the weight of her responsibilities. This day was not just a celebration of her achievements. It was a chance to honor the legacy of a forgotten woman who had paved the way for her. Sitting at her desk, Tanya surrounded herself with pages of notes and drafts, her heart pounding as she began to weave together her own story with Dorothy's. Every word felt like a bridge connecting the past to the present, and she knew she had to do justice to Dorothy's voice. Tanya wrote late into the night, fueled by a mix of fear and determination, each sentence pouring out like a lifeline to the countless others who had been overlooked. Finally, the night before graduation, she stepped back from her computer and read through her speech. It felt powerful, raw, and honest, everything she hoped to convey. She knew it was time to speak the truth that had been buried for far too long. On the morning of graduation, Tanya stood in front of the mirror, the fabric of her gown shimmering softly in the morning light. She looked at herself, taking in the reflection of a girl who had fought hard to reach this moment. But more importantly, she saw the spirit of Dorothy within her, reminding her that this was not just her triumph, it was a collective victory, a shared moment of resilience. As she walked into the auditorium, the air buzzed with excitement. Friends and family filled the seats, their faces a mixture of joy and pride. Tanya could feel the weight of their expectations resting on her shoulders, but instead of fear, it was a profound sense of purpose that propelled her forward. She took her place at the podium, the microphone shining under the bright stage lights, and looked out over the crowd. The room fell silent, the chatter fading into an anticipatory hush. Taking a deep breath, she began, "Good evening, everyone. I stand before you today not only as a valedictorian but as a messenger of history, a history that is often overlooked, a history that is deeply intertwined with my own." As she spoke, Tanya felt the energy in the room shift. Her voice grew stronger, resonating with conviction. "Today I want to honor a remarkable woman, Dorothy Mayfield, who walked these very halls long before any of us. She was named valedictorian, yet her voice was silenced, her story erased from the school's history. But today we reclaim that history." Tanya's words flowed like a river, carrying the audience along with her. She recounted Dorothy's dreams, her struggles against systemic racism, and the courage it took to stand up in a world that wanted to keep her quiet. She spoke of the letters she had discovered, the dreams of a better future, and the incredible strength that Dorothy had embodied. As she shared Dorothy's speech, "We stand here today, not only for ourselves, but for all those who have come before us," Tanya felt the room shift again. She saw tears glistening in the eyes of her classmates and teachers, their expressions reflecting the weight of what she was sharing. For the first time, they were hearing the truth of the school's history, and it resonated deeply. In a climactic moment, Tanya held up Dorothy's medal, the light catching its tarnished surface. "This medal," she declared, "represents not just an individual achievement, but the dreams of every student who has ever been made to feel invisible. It's time we honor those dreams. It's time we acknowledge our history." With each word, Tanya felt the room begin to awaken. The murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd, a palpable energy surging as her classmates began to nod and lean in closer. She could sense the power of their collective consciousness shifting, the dawning realization that this was more than a speech, it was a movement. Tanya's voice rose with passion as she concluded, "We are not just standing on the shoulders of strength, we are building a legacy together. Let us ensure that Dorothy Mayfield's story is never forgotten again, that every student who walks these halls in the future knows the sacrifices made for their opportunities." Applause erupted, echoing like a thunderous wave, enveloping her in a warm embrace. Tanya stepped back from the podium, heart racing, breathless with the weight of what she had just done. She could feel the presence of her grandmother, her parents, and Dorothy, each of them standing with her, proud and unwavering. After the ceremony, the excitement in the air was palpable. Students and faculty alike gathered around Tanya, their faces lit with newfound understanding and respect. Conversations sparked around the importance of remembering history, the necessity of acknowledging those who had come before, and the collective responsibility they all shared in carrying the history forward. In the weeks following graduation, the movement Tanya had ignited took root. Students organized discussions about the school's history, pushing for a more inclusive curriculum that recognized the contributions of individuals like Dorothy. Tanya was invited to speak at community forums, her voice echoing through the town as she shared Dorothy's story in her own. Finally, the school decided to create a historical display dedicated to Dorothy Mayfield. Tanya worked closely with her teachers and fellow students, curating a collection of photographs, newspaper clippings, and excerpts from Dorothy's speech. The display would honor not only Dorothy but also all the students who had fought for their right to be seen and heard. On the day of the unveiling, Tanya stood before the display, her heart swelling with pride. The room was filled with students, teachers, and community members, all gathered to witness this moment of remembrance and recognition. The air was thick with anticipation, a sense of closure and newfound appreciation hanging in the atmosphere. As the curtain dropped, revealing the display, Tanya's breath caught in her throat. There, framed beautifully, was Dorothy's photograph, her young face radiating strength and hope. Below it, the words "We stand on shoulders of strength" were emblazoned, a reminder of the power of resilience and the importance of legacy. Tanya stepped forward, tears glistening in her eyes as she addressed the crowd. Today we honor not just a name in an old yearbook, but a legacy of strength, courage, and dreams that were never realized. Dorothy Mayfield's story is now part of our history, and it will never be forgotten again. We stand together, united in our determination to ensure that every voice matters. The applause that followed was thunderous, a crescendo of unity and respect that echoed throughout the auditorium. Tanya felt a profound sense of fulfillment wash over her. This was her legacy, a tribute to Dorothy, and a promise to herself and her community to carry this fight forward. As the event concluded, Tanya's heart felt full. She had not only honored Dorothy's legacy, but had also found her own voice, a voice that would continue to advocate for justice, truth, and recognition. The struggles she had faced, the moments of doubt, and the bullying, all of it had led her to this point. The closing shot of the film captured Tanya walking through the school, her heart lighter than it had ever been. Behind her, the historical display shone brightly, a testament to resilience and an unwavering commitment to truth. Tanya knew that as she headed off to college, she would carry with her not just her dreams, but the dreams of countless others who had come before her. She was ready to honor the past while forging a new path for the future, determined to ensure that the stories of those who had been silenced would always be heard. In her heart, she repeated Dorothy's words as a mantra: "We stand on shoulders of strength." It was a promise to herself, a reminder of the importance of history, and a call to action for anyone who had ever felt unseen or unheard. Together, they would create a world where every voice mattered and every story was valued, leaving a legacy of resilience for generations to come.